everybody, and thank you so much for attending the first of Asialink's Nuclear Risks webinars. My name is Martine Letts and I'm the Group CEO of Asialink. The mitigation of nuclear risks in the Indo-Pacific region is an imperative, yet under-discussed issue. In the face of a rapidly changing security environment, it is more important than ever that we understand the complexities of these risks. Asialink's webinar series will begin to tackle some of the key questions and look at some possible actions for Australia in nuclear diplomacy, where Australia was very prominent, particularly in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are dialing in from today. And for me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people whose land we will discuss today in this seminar. Throughout the webinar, I invite you all to submit questions for our speakers. You can do that through the Q&A function, and we will endeavour at the end to answer some of your questions in the Q&A segment. I'd now like to simply briefly introduce our distinguished speakers for today, both with considerable senior career experience in managing the issues of nuclear risks during their time in office, who will be in conversation for this first scene-setting webinar. Former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans AC, who served in Federal Parliament for 21 years, holding, in addition to the Foreign Affairs portfolio, a number of ministerial appointments. From 2000 to 2009, he was President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, and from 2010 to 2019, Chancellor of the Australian National University. He's also co-chaired two major international commissions, one on intervention and state sovereignty, and critically for this afternoon, on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Our second participant is Peter Varghese AO, Chancellor of the University of Queensland, and our chair, the chair of the Asialink Advisory Council. From 2012 to 2016, he was Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and other senior appointments have included High Commissioner to India, High Commissioner to Malaysia, Director General of the Office of National Assessments, and Senior Advisor International to the Prime Minister of Australia. So, Peter, I'm now handing over to you to steer us through this, what promises to be a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Martine, for your introductions, and can I add my welcome to all of our participants in the webinar today, and a very special welcome to my partner in conversation, to Gareth Evans, who really needs no introduction to this group. Gareth, I can't think of a better person to kick off this nuclear risk series of seminars than you, because you have been closely involved in issues of nuclear disarmament, how to get to the elimination of nuclear weapons over a very long period of time, not just as Foreign Minister, but also as co-chair of the Independent Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation. And I actually want to start there because clearly it seems to me for you, this is more than just a intellectual policy challenge. It seems to me that there's also something quite personal in what brings you to the issue of nuclear disarmament and the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I just wonder whether you could give us a bit of the backstory on that.
Well, of course, growing up as I did in the Cold War years, I was acutely conscious, because there's an awful lot of discussion about it, the risks of a nuclear conflagration. But my awakening and my personal sense of the sheer horror of what nuclear weapons involve really came with a student visit I paid, my very first overseas visit, in fact, in 1964 to Japan, when as part of that trip, we went, of course, to Hiroshima, and standing there underneath the epicenter of that bomb blast in August 45 in the Peace Museum, there's one particular exhibit that I saw, which has remained forever sort of etched in my memory and made a huge impact on me. And the exhibit was of a granite block from the front of a bank building against which someone had been sitting at 8:15 on that bright sunny morning when he or she was incinerated, vaporized basically by the bomb blast in a way that left a shadow on the granite block because the granite around it had crystallized. And I just thought then of the millions of real human beings, men, women, and children, who would be vaporized or crushed or boiled or baked or irradiated to death if a nuclear war ever broke out. And it just seemed to me then that whatever I chose to do or felt able to do or was able to do in later life, if I could do something to contribute to ridding the world of these most horrifying weapons, these most destructive and indiscriminately inhumane weapons ever invented, then that's what I should do. And I guess I don't think I've been very successful in that larger term aspiration, but the commitment and the very deep personal commitment has been there for a very long time. And I do trace it back to that particular moment, that real personal impact. And I think it's incredibly important that people do see this issue, not just in arid argumentative terms, abstract terms, defence policy terms, but do see it in human terms, because that's what will motivate us to get a final solution or ultimate solution to this horrifying issue.
Well, there are a somber set of images, Gareth, but it does remind us that behind all of the policy and other work we do are the lives of people. So I'm glad you framed it in that way. Now, these webinars are going to be all about nuclear risks. So let's go straight to the question of risk. And I want to ask you, how real is the risk of nuclear catastrophe today? I mean, the bulletin clock, the doomsday clock, has it at 90 seconds to midnight. That's closer than I think it's ever been. Is that realistic? Is it alarmist? How real is the risk at the moment?
I don't think it's alarmist at all. And let's unpick the issue a bit by first of all focusing on the scale of the destruction that these weapons are now capable of causing, and then the prospect of their actual use. In terms of the scale of the destruction, we need to recognize that despite the big drawdown that followed of the stockpiles of the US and Soviet Union that followed the end of the Cold War, we still have now in existence 13,000 nuclear warheads, with between them a destructive capability of something like 100,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. We have about 4,000 of those weapons actually physically deployed. Russia has 5,500. Russia has about 6,000. The United States has about 5,500. The other 1,300 with the other nuclear armed states combined: China, France, the UK, India, Pakistan, Israel, and now North Korea. And of those 13,000 weapons, plus or minus, about 4,000 are actually physically deployed. And even more alarmingly, 2,000 of the Russian and US weapons are on very dangerously high alert status, ready to be launched on warning in the event of an attack or a perceived attack, with a decision window for each decision-making president of 4 to 8 minutes on either side. So you've got all these things sitting there on a knife edge, and vastly destructive. What's the prospect of their use? Well, as the Canberra Commission that we initiated in 1996 says, so long as any nuclear weapons remain in existence, they are bound one day to be used, if not deliberately, through deliberate aggression, then by accident or miscalculation or system error or human error. I think we can argue, and we'll come back to this, I guess, the real likelihood of deliberate aggressive use, including in our own region. But of course, we do now have to acknowledge that that prospect is higher than it has been for quite some time as a function of general global and regional fragility, the breakdown of long-standing nuclear arms control agreements, something I guess we'll come back to later in this discussion. And we've also got Russia now talking openly about the possibility of their use in the conflict with Ukraine, something that we haven't heard talk about for literally decades. We can argue about the deliberately aggressive use, but what I don't think there can be any argument about is what is now and always has been the absolutely omnipresent risk of use through accident or miscalculation or human error or system error or human idiocy. the fact that we haven't had a nuclear weapon actually used in conflict for over 75 years is not a result of statesmanship. It's not a result of system integrity. It's not a result of infallibility or the inherent stability of nuclear deterrence. It's been sheer dumb luck. And I think it's utterly wishful thinking to believe that that luck will continue, given what we now know about how many times during the Cold War years we came extraordinarily close to a complete breakdown of command and control systems. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is one famous example. Operation Able Archer in 1983, when a US NATO test mission was perceived as an actual nuclear attack. What we know is how close we came to catastrophe on umpteen occasions during the Cold War years. Given what we also know about how much less sophisticated the command and control systems of many of the newer nuclear armed states are compared with the supposed sophistication of the really big boys. And given what we know and can guess about how much more sophisticated and capable cyber offense will be over cyber defense in the future, the prospect of something just going wrong, miscalculation, unintended escalations, human error, system error, is very, very real indeed. And these weapons may never be coldly and deliberately used to wage aggressive war, although we can't minimize that completely, that possibility. But there's a really very high probability indeed that they will be one day used sooner or later in the way that I've just described. And that, I think, should concentrate our minds really quite fundamentally.
So Gareth, let me draw you out a bit on dumb luck, which is actually a neat way to put it. But playing the devil's advocate, I get the luck bit of it. I mean, you look at the number of weapons, you look at the close calls we've had, you look at how miscalculation can occur. But sitting behind dumb luck is a fairly elaborate, some would argue very sophisticated theory of nuclear deterrence, which many would argue has kept the peace for the last 85 years, notwithstanding close calls. How dumb is nuclear deterrence if at the end of the day it's only dumb luck which is keeping us from a catastrophe?
Well, although there's a real psychological comfort, obviously, in the existence of nuclear weapons by those countries who have them or believe they're sheltering under them, although there's some ground for thinking they may have produced a degree of caution in the past that might otherwise have been lacking at the margin in the way in which countries confronted each other, it's my very strong belief that the arguments for the deterrent utility of nuclear weapons have been vastly oversold, and that really it's problematic, even the basic storyline that is so familiar, that one fundamentally brilliant things that nuclear weapons did was to bring an end to the World War II in Japan by forcing the Japanese surrender. And that's a theme that runs through, of course, the Oppenheimer film we've all just seen. But even that is really, I think, to be seen now as a myth, because the vast bulk of modern scholarship has concluded that it wasn't Hiroshima and Nagasaki that forced Japan to the surrender table. It was Russia's declaration of war against Japan 2 days or 1 day before Nagasaki that was the really decisive factor. But on the deterrent utility, there's 3 scenarios that are constantly talked about. One is the utility of nuclear weapons in stopping war between the major nuclear powers themselves. That whatever else they've done, they've stopped all-out war for all those years between the United States and Russia. But during the I doubt that even that stands up to rational calculation, rational analysis, because during all those decades of confrontation between the Soviet Union and the US, there's just no evidence at all that's ever emerged that at any stage either side was absolutely determined to cold-bloodedly initiate a war against the other, but was deterred by the prospect of a nuclear response if they did so. I don't think you need nukes to explain why the United States and NATO are now so reluctant to escalate the conflict with Russia over Ukraine into a contest between Russia and the nuclear side. The reality is the butcher's bill through any conventional war between these major powers was always going to be absolutely gigantic, and the butcher's bill in the context of a direct confrontation now between US, NATO, and Russia would be enormous. And I think that's a sufficient explanation of why the caution has been there, along with the taboo, which is still holding to a significant extent. Then you get the argument about the utility of nuclear deterrence as between other players and the claimed utility of nuclear weapons in deterring large-scale direct conventional attacks. But there's many cases when you go back through the last few decades where non-nuclear powers have either directly attacked nuclear powers or have not been deterred by the prospect of nuclear powers coming in against them if they mounted such an attack. I mean, think of the Korean War, think of Vietnam War, think of Afghanistan, think of the first Gulf War. In each case, initiated by a non-nuclear power against either a nuclear power directly or in the knowledge that nuclear power would be very quick to come in on the other side. In 1982, I've just been reading the story again, the United Kingdom sent 3 nuclear submarines, not only propelled, but armed submarines, to warn Argentina against threatening the Aucklands. They sent them south to circle around the Falkland Islands. That was far more menacing than anything on the Argentine side, but that nuclear deterrence, so-called, completely failed to stop the conventional attack, that invasion then occurred. And then the third scenario that's constantly talked about, and it's the apparent belief of a number of smaller states like North Korea that a handful of nuclear weapons is their ultimate guarantor against externally forced, regime change. But that again has very little rational foundation. There's no doubt that the nuclear weapons are giving the North Koreans some psychological comfort, but are they rationally doing the job? Because possession of weapons that can't be used or can only be used with the prospect of suicidal consequences are really not much of a deterrent at all. Weapons that are not supported by the kind of infrastructure, for example, missile submarines, that would give them a reasonable prospect of a country surviving long enough to mount a retaliatory attack. Again, weapons without such backup are not remotely credible as deterrents. In the case of the DPRK, it knows very well that homicide would be nuclear homicide would be a recipe for suicide. And not only an attack against the United States, but against Japan or South Korea. And I think, just at a footnote, I think it's similarly fanciful to think that Ukraine would have escaped attack from Russia this time round if it had retained that stockpile of nuclear weapons that it had, because any use by them or threatened use, any actual use by them, would have invited a massive retaliation, which would have been completely suicidal and could not possibly have saved Ukraine's existence. So I think if you work your way through, I mean, it's a much longer argument we'll have time for in this discussion, but if you work your way through each of the sort of familiar scenarios for the purported utility and reality of deterrence, I think they just fade away. It's psychologically important, yes, but practically important, I don't think.
Well, that's quite a good segue into extended nuclear deterrence, because for a country that's not an established nuclear weapon state, who may or may not contemplate acquiring nuclear weapons, sitting under the umbrella of extended nuclear deterrence may provide a good alternative. So Australia is...
Just a minute. Oh, now it's even worse. I'm sorry, the lighting's gone crazy.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just had to put up with a shadow across my nose. I'm sorry about that, but the sun will go down in a few moments. So, extended deterrence.
We'll treat it as a halo, Gareth. Yeah, so for a country like Australia, which is a close ally of the US, sits under the umbrella of extended nuclear deterrence, wouldn't we be mugs to give that up?
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I think you've got to untangle. There's two separate issues here. One is the utility of and reality of extended deterrence, and the other is the utility of extended nuclear deterrence. Extended deterrence really just means, in our case, the United States would be willing to use its formidable conventional power to defend us as an ally should we come under attack. And I think that still has some borderline credibility to the extent that it's sufficient for me, at least, not to want to argue for Australia to walk away from the US alliance, which gives us not only intelligence and technological support, but does have some, again, I guess, some deterrent utility insofar as other potential adversaries would see the US potentially there coming in to protect us. But I'm really not alone, I think, in believing that it's highly unlikely that the United States now, under any administration, not just another Trump, would be willing to expend blood and treasure in defending Australia in situations where its own national interests were not directly threatened. I just don't think the guarantee that we think we have, the insurance we think we have, of that kind of conventional firepower coming to our aid is very credible. And I'm not alone, I think, also in thinking that enmeshing ourselves even more closely, ever more closely with US military at the potential risk of our own sovereign agency in the hope of buying continued insurance in the future for that extended deterrence. I don't think I'm alone in thinking that a lot of that's just making us more vulnerable to the kind of attacks that we hope by our alliance to deter. So there's a question mark even about conventional extended deterrence generally. But there has to be an even bigger question mark when you add the nuclear dimension to it and talk about extended nuclear deterrence, which means believing that the United States would be willing to use its nuclear weapons to defend us or other allies similarly placed should we come under attack. But I really, short of a situation where the US itself is fully engaged in a war where the protection of some of its assets in Australia, perhaps like Pine Gap, mean that it feels the need to give some protection to Australia, to at least those assets. Short of that sort of situation, I think the notion that the United States would risk losing Los Angeles in order to save Sydney or to save Seoul, I think that just defies credibility. And I think it defies credibility to think that any potential adversary of Australia would believe that the United States would be prepared to risk a nuclear retaliation in that particular way by coming to our defence and using nukes to do that. So I think essentially the argument for Australia giving up reliance on extended nuclear deterrence is really just an extension of my more general argument about the deterrent utility of nuclear weapons being basically illusory and the risk of retaining nuclear stockpiles by anyone outweighing any conceivable benefit that might these days flow from them.
So look, I take your point that there's no guarantee in our alliance relationship, and it would be a mistake to pretend otherwise. But equally, a potential adversary could not guarantee that the United States would not come to our assistance in that way. So at the very least, surely it complicates the calculation of anyone, of any power that's looking to move in an aggressive way against Australia.
Well, it probably does complicate the calculation a little bit, and it certainly gives, again, psychological comfort to all sorts of people to think that these things are in existence. But I think you've got to be pretty fiercely rational-minded in looking at what the actual probabilities are of use in these situations. To defend an Australia in circumstances where the United States his own national interests are not immediately and existentially at risk. The notion that the United States would put itself at the risk of nuclear retaliation from others by coming to our defence, if we were under nuclear attack or threatened nuclear attack, I mean, I think it's just stretching the imagination beyond credibility. And that's even before we move into the sort of the Trump era, where the whole notion of alliances is more as encumbrances than as assets has been so dominant and may be dominant again. But even if you do give some sliver of credibility, as you do and Hugh White does and Sam Roggeveen does in his latest book, much to my dismay, there's some sliver of credibility to the possible utility of nuclear weapons and the possible desirability of acquiring our own. Even if you do that, you've got to think about the other dimension of this, which is where I came in, the sheer dumb luck issue, that any continued possession by anybody of nuclear weapons runs the risk of them being used through system error and miscalculation, quite apart from deliberate use. And it was that consideration that was particularly crucial, I think, in leading that gaggle of hardcore, Cold War realists, Kissinger, Schultz, Nunn, and Perry, to produce their series of famous Wall Street Journal op-eds 10 years or so ago now, saying that, we believed in the deterrent utility of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. But in the world as it now is, with these very vulnerable control and command systems all around the place, what we now know about the possibility of things going haywire in an unattended way, the advantages of possessing these things simply don't outweigh are not outweighed by any possible rewards. And there's also, of course, the proliferation dimension of this, which we must always have at the back of our minds. As the Canberra Commission said, so long as anyone has nuclear weapons, others will want them. And if the credibility of the deterrent utility credibility of nuclear weapons is insisted upon by a whole bunch of countries, but claiming that it's good for us, then it's very, very hard for us to go on resisting, as we've managed to do for a few decades, but very hard for us to go on resisting in perpetuity, others wanting to join that particular club. And the more players you've got, again, of course, the more the chances are of not only of deliberate use, but of inadvertent or accidental or erroneous use. So for all those reasons, I mean, I understand the arguments. We live with them all the time. But the sort of complacency that exists around the place, that these things are worth having, and there's no really great risk in placing bets upon their retention. I just think that's misconceived and misguided.
So look, I think the miscalculation argument is a very powerful one, and I now want to turn to the calculated use of nuclear weapons. What do you see as the risk of the first use of nuclear weapons, the actual risk of it, and particularly in our own region, in Asia and the Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, or whatever label you want to put on it? What's your sense of that risk?
Well, it's certainly not negligible. I mean, I don't think it's fantastically high, the risk of deliberate aggressive use, because each one of the scenarios that you identify as to possibly generating that deliberate aggressive use, the risks to the person who might be tempted to be the first player that are involved in that are so obvious that there's always going to be an inhibition about being the initiator. And I think the general sort of normative taboo, which has been around for a long time, does still have a fair degree of credence. It's come under stress with the kind of casual talk of Putin in the context of the Ukraine conflict. And you have to say that in that context, there still does exist, the possibility of use if this thing drags on without conclusion. But I have to say in parenthesis that the notion that there's something less troubling about the use of tactical nuclear weapons than strategic ones really doesn't stand up to very close scrutiny when you understand that the current definition of a tactical nuclear weapon is one of roughly the Hiroshima size, which killed over 100,000 people. And you're not talking about small bangs to deal with small military problems. You're talking about impacts of very potentially vast dimensions. So I just think the prospect of deliberate use is not high, but the possibility of small incidents in our own region, particularly escalating into much bigger incidents and with many miscalculations along the way, that's pretty real. And every war game that's ever been done about US-China potential conflict over Taiwan, which is one very obvious potential flashpoint. Every war game has been done about possible conflict over the Korean Peninsula again. Many of the war games that have been done in, evaluating the prospect of a major clash between India and Pakistan taking a nuclear dimension. Every one of those war games, I mean, it shows how easy it is for that escalating cycle to very quickly to come into play, and completely unintended escalations of quite small things into very large things. So I think that's the reality. I mean, we could spend the rest of this discussion talking about the basic dynamics of those regional flashpoint situations. But as I understand it, the next two seminars in these series are going to be discussing the regional dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region more specifically in much more detail. So perhaps we can keep our focus on the larger picture, while recognizing that, of course, is the context that's energizing this whole discussion.
Sure. So let's move to the outlook for nuclear arms control. And you spent a lot of time thinking through how we get to a zero outcome from where we are and all of the complexities that go with that. I think it's fair to say that there isn't a huge amount of momentum at the moment on getting rid of all nuclear weapons. How do you see the outlook for nuclear arms control? And in particular, where do you see this treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons fitting into that? And how should we think about that treaty from an Australian perspective?
Well, the depressing reality is that while the hands of the bulletin clock that you mentioned earlier show that the risk of catastrophe is as great as it's ever been, I think the goal of achieving the actual elimination of nuclear weapons is frankly as far away as it's ever been. The reality is that long-standing nuclear arms control agreements between the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union are now either dead. The ABM Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, they're all dead as dodos. Or other crucial treaties are on life support, like the New START Treaty, which limits actual strategic deployments of these weapons. Hopes for denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula and stopping Iran acquiring possibly nuclear weapons have run into the sand. The 2022 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference ended like so many of its predecessors, with no consensus at all on a final statement about the future of the non-proliferation regime, with Russia denying consensus by opposing any reference to the nuclear risks involved in the invasion of Ukraine. There's been no progress at all in moderating the salience of nuclear weapons in strategic doctrines of the United States or anyone else. The efforts to get moving on no first use, which Biden and Obama both sort of personally supported, have run into the sand. Stockpiles are growing in most of the nuclear states. So the nuclear arms control outlook environment at the moment is really pretty sad. There does appear to be one exception, which has got a lot of people very excited, and that's the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the treaty on the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has been in force now since January 2021. And it should certainly be welcomed as a very big normative step forward in delegitimizing nuclear weapons, to the extent that that treaty was negotiated and its adoption was supported by well over 120 states, the vast majority of UN member states. Initiated as it was by, incidentally, worth acknowledging, the Australian NGO, the ICAN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Prize for its efforts, but wasn't congratulated by Prime Minister Morrison. But that's another story. But the problem with the nuclear ban treaty is, while it does seem an advance, its significance is really more symbolic than substantive. It's binding, of course, on only those states joining it, and at the moment there's only 68 states that are party to it. And none of them are the nuclear armed states, and none of them are nuclear armed states allies or partners, and none of them are likely to do so for the immediately foreseeable future. Australia refused under previous governments to have anything at all to do with the treaty. That's now changed under the present Labor government, with Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong now at least committed to having us participate in meetings of the state parties as observers. And we've also indicated a willingness in principle, albeit a very heavily conditional willingness to join the treaty. But nobody should expect that anytime soon, not only in relation to us, but really any of the other really important players, the nuclear armed states in particular. The treaty is quite weak technically when it comes to safeguards, the absence of provisions for verification and enforcement. And there's also a particular problem for Australia in signing the treaty because of our alliance commitment to the United States, and in particular the joint facilities of Pine Gap, which are, let's face it, widely acknowledged to be involved in nuclear targeting and nuclear early warning, and generally assisting the US in the maintenance of its nuclear threat and delivery capability. And under the treaty, that's all completely verboten. You can't do any of that stuff. And so long as the US alliance stays, I think it will just be impossible for that reason for Australia to join the treaty, however much we might, be emotionally inclined to do so. So all of that means, I think, not just for Australia, but globally, that the goal of global zero, of complete elimination anytime soon, is really pretty far distant, and that it just doesn't particularly help to put all our eggs in that basket. And it certainly doesn't help to make, here as elsewhere, the best the enemy of the good by resisting lesser forms of movement towards nuclear arms control. And here I think there's quite a lot to be said for adopting a nuclear risk reduction approach, focusing really all our efforts, certainly Australia's efforts, not for the time being on ultimate elimination, although we must never lose sight of that goal for all the reasons I've talked about earlier on. But nuclear risk reduction is the name of the game. So there's quite a lot we could say about that, but if you want me to just give you a very brief description of what's involved here, I think there's four things in particular, and we spelt them out in four priorities in particular, and we spelt them out in the Australia-Japan Commission that you referred to in passing before, that I co-chaired. What I call the 4 Ds. First of all, doctrine, risk reduction in terms of getting universal buy-in for a doctrine of no first use. Second D, deployment, reducing deployments, drastically reducing the number of weapons, presently 4,000 of them internationally, that are ready for immediate use. De-alerting, the third D, taking as many as humanly possible of those 2,000 weapons now on very dangerously high alert, hair trigger alert, off that status to reduce the possibility, to increase the decision time that's associated with their use, and decrease the possibility of human error or system error in their use. And the fourth D is just decreased numbers, reducing the overall global total quite dramatically down. We argued in that commission from the present 13,000 to something like 2,000. Now, I mean, a world with rather lower numbers of nuclear weapons, with very few of them physically deployed, with practically none of them on hair trigger alert launch status, and with every nuclear armed state being genuinely committed to a no first use doctrine. While such a world wouldn't be perfect, because we'd still have nuclear weapons, it would certainly be a hell of a lot safer and saner than the one we have at the moment. And I think there's a huge amount to be said for putting a lot of political capital on the line for everyone around the world who's interested in this, in trying to advance that risk reduction agenda, and stepping back a bit from getting overexcited about setting unrealisably early targets for global zero. When we get the risk reduction, we can get momentum going, we can delegitimize the use of nuclear weapons, we can get more people willing to contemplate the possibility of no longer having that comfort blanket at all. But for the moment, the immediate target is to just reduce the reality of those risks.
Thanks, Gareth. Look, in the time we've got left, I want to turn now to Australia's role in all of this. I mean, you referred to the Albanese government changing its position slightly on the PPNW, and Australia has I think it's fair to say, a pretty respectable tradition of activism on nuclear disarmament and nuclear diplomacy. Your time as Foreign Minister, the Canberra Commission, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which had strong bipartisan support in Australia. What role can we now play? What would you recommend that we be doing that we're not doing to take up this baton of nuclear arms control?
Well, as I think you've acknowledged, Peter, Australia has played a more useful role in the past than many people may imagine, with generally a pretty strong record on arms control. I mean, including bringing to conclusion the Chemical Weapons Convention on the other weapons of mass destruction side of the house, but also our nuclear credentials, which certainly burnished by the groundbreaking Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, which Paul Keating initiated in '96. The Rudd government's Australia-Japan Commission, which you mentioned. But as you've also said, periodically these things have had some degree of coalition buy-in as well. Very notably, the effort to bring the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to conclusion in the United Nations, which was very much a Howard government achievement, which I do acknowledge. It's also the case, of course, that Australia has played a pretty significant role in international and regional institution building. In this geopolitical space. I mean, the founding of the UN itself under Doc Evatt all those years ago. More recently, our role in creating APEC and the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asian Summit. And I think we can play that role again. I mean, Anthony Albanese, in his Shangri-La speech in June, said that, I quote him, Australia is engaged not as a spectator or commentator, but as a champion for peace and prosperity in the region and the world. So we do have aspirations to, again, not just be a spectator and a commentator. So what form could that energetic commitment take? I think it's important to appreciate that Australia's status as a close ally of the United States, and as such one of the nuclear umbrella states, does give us a particularly significant potential role, a seat at the table, an important seat at the US alliance table. Whether anyone in Washington is disposed to listen is another question, but at least our voice has a chance of being heard. I think with Kevin Rudd exercising the kind of authority that he has, the stature he has, there's a much better chance, as good a chance as we've had for a long time of having our voice heard on these issues. And I think what is absolutely crucial is that we do articulate very clearly that risk reduction agenda, and try and mobilize support among allies and partners and other players in the region for that, including with Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is a particularly important player in this space because it's traditionally played the role for decades now as the convener on all the nuclear arms control issues for the so-called non-aligned movement, NAM, which is still quite a significant player in international discourse, the way it caucuses around these major multilateral meetings. And I think if we make, and this is an issue on which we do have some some hope for buy-in from our colleagues. But I think one of the most important immediate objectives, if you're looking for prioritizing something which would really make a difference, my money would be on the no first use doctrinal commitment by the United States. Obama was very, very keen personally to go down that path. Joe Biden, we know, was personally keen to go down that path, or the functional equivalent of it, declaring that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons was to retaliate against nuclear attack, not for anything else. But he was dissuaded. Both of them were dissuaded, not only by their own defense and security establishments, but by their allies. Japan was reluctant, not supportive at all, despite all its history. South Korea, the same. The Eastern Central European allies in NATO, the same. And Australia. Australia was opposing the United States, embracing that no first use position. And, one would have thought that's just a start in getting some sanity back into this international policy debate. And it's an issue on which I think our voice, given our status as a US ally, can be very important. We didn't take an opportunity under the new government to make an issue of this when it did come up at the NPT review conference in middle of last year. I hope that will be different in the future. So that's where I'd be putting my efforts at the moment, and I think on past record, we can make a difference.
Thanks, Gareth. Look, I think we might now see whether we have some questions from our participants. So Martine, can you?
Yeah, thanks, Peter and Gareth. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, which not surprisingly focus a little more on AUKUS. But before we go there, I actually would like to just build on Gareth's suggestion about looking at a no first use doctrine effort. It just reminds me that China's strategic doctrine seems to have moved from no first use to a more aggressive stance. And Gareth, you alluded to that in your response about the fact that, strategic doctrines have become tougher, including what would appear a different stance in China on no first use. How might China be moved back to that approach? And what are the chances that the US and China could come to the table to talk about this, or at least about some CBMs that might lead into that territory? What would it take?
Well, China hasn't moved completely away. China has not moved completely away from no first use. It's obviously toying with the idea of changing its doctrine, but it hasn't made that shift. And obviously, on the face of it, the significant build-up in its nuclear stockpile and its armory is at odds with that, because it's traditionally taken an absolute minimal deterrence posture, taken the view that having around 300 weapons, which is what we believe it has, would be enough amply to deter any potential adversary, and as long as it has some retaliatory capability with its submarines in particular, then it didn't need to go further. Look, when you got the sort of breakthrough from implausible players like Gorbachev and Reagan, with the famous statement that not only that nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, but they came within a hair's breadth of accepting a mutual decision to eliminate their respective stockpiles. And this was still, the Cold War was by no means remotely over, and the tensions were still very high. So I think, provided the Americans have some sense from their key allies that this is something that their allies would be prepared to accept and would make an important contribution to stabilizing and not further adding to the competitive anxieties that are out there, I think the Americans could very credibly put that on the table as a discussion issue between themselves and China, and win a lot of global support for doing so, and for China to come back out, and which it might be prepared to do in the context of United States movement on this front, for China to come back out and make a reinforced commitment to its basic belief that wars can't be won through nuclear weapons, and that and that minimal deterrence is the way to go, and no first use is certainly the way to be committed, then I think that's an initiative worth taking. Of course, we should put the caveat in that no first use is words. It's not actions. It's a commitment to not be the first to ever use nuclear weapons. And unless you back that up by a bunch of other things in terms of taking most of your weapons off that high alert status and reducing your deployments and not increasing your stockpiles beyond endurance, unless you back it up with those other risk reduction measures that I talked about, maybe it doesn't have all that much credibility. But as was a periodic theme in our discussion, I think, Peter, that the psychological dimension of this thing is the one that has kept nuclear weapons alive. And I think anything that can be done to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons, the centrality of nuclear weapons in countries' thinking and posturing, then that's enormously helpful in getting us to where most of us really want to be.
Yeah,
I
thanks.
don't know. What do you think, Peter?
Peter, maybe I'll just save your answer because I've got a codicil question to this, and then we'll go to AUKUS, I promise. Just going back to the extended deterrence problem, which is in part related to what you just said, Gareth. If extended deterrence was no longer a US policy, would that drive countries like Japan to want to acquire nuclear weapons and increase nuclear tensions in the region? So this goes back to is there any value in nuclear deterrence? And I don't think you talked about the fact that countries like Japan find it a very valuable way of not having to go down that track. And that's for both of you to answer.
Well, obviously, that's the risk, that if the US does step back from that Japan and even more South Korea, because public opinion in South Korea is far more relaxed about nuclear weapons than public opinion in Japan ever has been, or I suspect ever will be. And that's a risk that if the US steps back from that role, countries will take. But again, all I can say is that what is the deterrent utility of acquiring these things when you apply not just a psychological comfort test, but you apply a rational use test? What are the circumstances in which Japan would ever be able to actually use its deterrent without risk of total annihilation of all its cities? Because if it came to a war with China and if it came to a nuclear exchange with China, I mean, you'd have 200 weapons being exchanged, and I mean it's all over. So I mean, just how much both sides know in all these scenarios that the other side has acute restraints, the limitations on its capacity to ever use these things. Both sides know that the others will talk the talk and escalate the threat, as Russia has done in the context of Ukraine. But everyone knows in these circumstances that the risk of actually using these things is enormous. And when both sides know that, when these things are basically unusable, then I think they do lose their rational deterrent impact. They don't necessarily lose their psychological deterrent impact or their psychological. Rationally, it's just very hard to see where these things actually have in the past made a difference or will really make a difference in the future. But I mean, I don't know, Peter, you might have a different view about this.
Well, I mean, I think there is a high risk that if countries in the region who currently rely on an alliance with the United States or extended nuclear deterrence, for whatever reason, lose faith in that protection, that they will seriously contemplate acquiring a nuclear weapon capability. Because I think the psychological hold of nuclear weapons giving you the last bastion security is still very strong. And it may well be ultimately irrational in that they are ultimately unusable, but I don't think that necessarily will diminish countries wanting to think about it. I mean, I think North Korea, for instance, probably thinks it gets a measure of protection from attack from having a nuclear weapon capability. You could argue that that psychology applies in Iran as well. So I don't think you're ever going to get a completely rational calculation in this space. I think it's going to be a combination of psychology and rationality, and where you put the weight on which element, Gareth, I think is one of the points you're trying to bring out.
Yeah, well, the big problem is while you're comfortably snuggling into your psychological security blanket, you've got all these bloody things which have a huge prospect of being used non-aggressively as a result of system error and human idiocy and all those dimensions that I think have just been not a sufficiently central part of the equation. It is not risk-free to have a big poultice of nuclear weapons at your disposal, even if you're never going to be the first to use them, and even if they're never going to be deliberately aggressively used at all. So anyway, we go around in circles with this argument, but that's why I think it's right to be skeptical about US extended nuclear deterrence as being of any value to us, just as it's right to be skeptical about US extended deterrence and the need and why it's important for us to develop our own defensive capability without having reliance on an insurance policy which may never actually deliver, and which is perhaps even less likely to be delivered than most people leave. So yeah, sure. I mean, I understand all of that, but it doesn't, and it means that it makes sense for us to focus our attention on the risk reduction agenda, because even within an extended nuclear deterrence environment with a lot of people in the nuclear umbrella, if we had a genuine 4Ds environment in place and genuine no first use doctrine among all the nuclear armed states, there'd be a hell of a lot less risk to be worried about than is the case right now. And I think that's what our priority ought to be.
Thanks. That's been a good discussion. So just bringing it home very quickly to a couple of the questions here in the chat. So the question about the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, how is it perceived by other nations? Does it still satisfy Australia's treaty obligations? And then also, does the AUKUS also signal Australia increasing its focus and investment in nuclear? The question isn't very specific about what kind of nuclear, whether it's power. So I think really the question about AUKUS and its impact on our relationship with our countries and treaty obligations is a good one to quickly cover.
Well, the non-proliferation implications of AUKUS, are significant and have to be addressed. And it is important that this argument that's going on in Vienna at the International Atomic Energy Agency at the moment, succeed if AUKUS is to go ahead and appropriate safeguards be universally accepted, that there's no risk of proliferation associated with this nuclear propulsion device. I think most of the countries in our own region sort of understand and accept that. And that dimension of it is not, to me, the most troubling of it. I mean, the issue of nuclear waste disposal is another dimension of it, which raises acute practical problems, or will in many decades ahead, that I don't think should be a showstopper. To me, by far the biggest worries about AUKUS are the cost benefit of these eye-wateringly expensive boats that may have a role that is of real utility to the United States in fighting a war in northern waters, but as a dubious utility as compared with other ways of expending that money, so far as many commentators, myself included, are concerned. And I'm also very worried about the loss of sovereign agency, given the extraordinary degree of enmeshment in US military procedures and processes that are involved in this whole enterprise. And it's that dimension of it that I think has more people in our neighbourhood edgy than the purely nuclear proliferation dimension of it. It's the notion that we're allying ourselves with a United States that is still determined to exercise primacy, dominance in the region, and prepared to take sort of military risks to get there. And where are we as an Australian nation? Are we making our own decisions, or are we just sucked up in that larger US agenda? And that's something that obviously a number of countries, while they're being quite polite about it in the region at the moment, are concerned about, and I think not unreasonably so.
Thanks, Gareth. Well, I think, unfortunately, we've now run out of time. We're 1 minute before closing, and we do like to finish on time. So that was an incredibly rich discussion, and it really, this is a cliche alert, but the wicked problems that we confront with this entire dynamic. But I think really timely for us to think far more about this, and really think what our policy responses should be, particularly given the fact that we are no longer just talking about a transatlantic problem. We're very much talking about a problem that has transferred and in some ways has even more risk points. And Gareth, you listed some of them within our own region. And as you mentioned, we will be in our next 2 webinars trying to drill down a little bit about analysing what those risks are, what are the possible scenarios that might unfold, and then a question about what can Australia be doing in terms of its involvement in trying to get some people to the table. Are there regional arrangements that might work? Are there sort of unique regional ways of dealing with this? So those will be the subjects of our next 2 webinars, which will take place in late October. And of course, we'll be setting out invitations for those. So just remains for me to say a really warm thank you for well, first of all, for your commitment, Gareth, to this agenda. It's been a life's work, and you've been passionate about it from the start and very consistent. And it's great to hear that passion hasn't in any way subsided. And it's a very important conversation. And Peter, thank you so much for the conversation. You had a lot of insights into this matter over the years, and we're very lucky to have had both of you with such expertise and experience, helping us, I hope, raise greater awareness of that this really is a challenge for us, and that we need to, if possible, have a voice at the table, particularly as it comes to our region. I'm seeing lots of hearts and clapping signals and other things coming up saying thank you from the audience. So thanks to the audience for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at our next nuclear risk webinar. Good evening.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Martine. Thanks, everyone, for listening.